In October of 1807, a solitary fur trapper named Elias Crale walks out of an unmapped mountain valley carrying 3 iron traps and the finest beaver pelts anyone at Fort Raymond has ever seen. 6 men convince him to guide them back to the valley, and 4 of them never return. The valley vanishes from every subsequent American map for 40 years, replaced by blank terrain and impassable ridge markings. In 1947, a Missouri Historical Society archivist processing a forgotten estate donation discovers that one of Crale's 3 iron traps carries a map scratched into its jaw plate, coordinates deliberately excluded from the published Lewis and Clark expedition record on orders from the Secretary of War. The buried truth reveals not a natural geography forgotten by accident, but a deliberate act of cartographic erasure orchestrated to protect a trade and territorial negotiation worth more than any single American state. 3 beaver pelts hit the trading counter at Fort Raymond on the morning of October 14th, 1807, and the man who owned them said nothing. The fort's senior factor, a Scottish-born fur agent named Donald Macaulay, had been grading pelts for 19 years along the upper Missouri River. He had handled prime beaver from the Mandan villages, from the Knife River bottomlands, from the banks of the Yellowstone where it ran cold and fast through stands of old cottonwood. He had seen exceptional pelts. He had never seen anything like these 3. Each hide measured 17 inches across the underbelly stretch, 3 full inches beyond the premium grade threshold that Macaulay's own ledger defined as extraordinary. The fur was dark and impossibly dense at the base, with a surface sheen that his apprentice clerk would later describe in a letter home as looking like flat water at midnight. Macaulay pressed both thumbs into the deepest section of the middle pelt and held them there for 11 seconds before he looked up. The man across the counter was lean in the way that a winter does leaning. Not starvation, but work that never stopped. He stood at perhaps 5 feet 9 inches, trail-worn, carrying 3 iron traps slung over his left shoulder on a cord of braided rawhide. His name was Elias Crale. He had no fixed address in any territory ledger. He had no contract with the Missouri Fur Company, no license issued under the 1796 Trade and Intercourse Act, and no recorded next of kin at any American settlement east of the Mississippi. He appears in exactly 4 surviving documents prior to that October morning. A single line in a Kaskaskia provisioner's journal from 1803, a trapper's debt notation in a St. Louis shipping ledger from 1805, a name on a Fort Bellefontaine overnight roster from the spring of 1806, and a brief notation in the personal diary of William Clark himself, dated July 11, 1806, which reads simply, "A trapper named Crale passed our return camp. Gives no account of himself. Heading north." Macaulay offered him $4.50 per pelt for prime grade. Crale set the 3 iron traps on the counter beside the pelts without responding. Macaulay raised the offer to $6 per pelt before Crale spoke. "I'll take trade goods," Crale said. "Lead, powder, salt, 3 months of provisions." Macaulay noted the transaction in his ledger under the date October 14th, 1807. In the column reserved for the trapper's home district, he wrote a single word: unknown. Nobody at Fort Raymond asked Crale where he had been. That was customary on the frontier. A trapper's valley was a trapper's livelihood. You did not ask. But 6 men at Fort Raymond looked at those pelts and two of them went quietly to find a factor willing to ask anyway. They found nobody willing. What they found instead was Crale himself, sitting by the river that evening, cleaning one of the 3 iron traps with a piece of tow cloth, staring west toward a ridgeline that none of them could name. The year 1807 sits at a peculiar fulcrum in American history. Lewis and Clark had returned only 14 months before Crale walked into Fort Raymond. Their published journals would not reach public circulation for another 7 years. But the knowledge that an enormous Western territory had been mapped, however partially, had landed like a torch in a dry barn inside the fur trade industry. Every company, every independent factor, every St. Louis outfitter with enough capital to provision an expedition was suddenly and urgently in the business of filling in the blank spaces that Lewis and Clark had sketched and left incomplete. The upper Missouri watershed in 1807 was blank in ways that are almost impossible to imagine from the vantage point of the present. The river itself was charted imperfectly. Its major tributaries were noted in the expedition's field journals, though not always by their correct names or accurate dimensions. But the valleys running perpendicular to those tributaries, the interior drainage basins, the high elevation meadows, the sheltered pocket canyons that lay 3 and 4 days' travel from any navigable waterway, those existed in an informational void. They had Indian names. They had been hunted for centuries by peoples with no interest in publishing their geography for the benefit of American fur companies. They appeared on no American map. No British Hudson's Bay cartography touched them. They were, in the fullest literal sense, unmapped. Into this void walked men like Elias Crale, solitary, contracted to no one, beholden to nothing but the price of beaver felt on the European market and the practical knowledge of how to survive in terrain that would kill an ordinary man in 11 days. The winter of 1806 to 1807 had been severe across the Northern Territories. 3 licensed trading expeditions had turned back before reaching their winter rendezvous points. One party of 7 men, outfitted by the newly formed Missouri Fur Company, had lost 4 members to frostbite and starvation before abandoning their season entirely at the confluence of the Bighorn River. By the spring of 1807, the fur trade companies were desperate. European demand for beaver pelt, used primarily in the production of felt hats, an industry that consumed approximately 120,000 pelts per year at its peak in the 1820s, was already accelerating. Every pelt left in an unmapped valley belonged to whoever found it first. Elias Crale had left Fort Bellefontaine in April of 1807. He carried, by the best reconstruction from the provisioner's notes that survive, 40 pounds of trade goods, 2 months of hard rations, a flintlock rifle, a tomahawk, a skinning knife, and 3 hand-forged iron leg-hold traps. The traps were not unusual for their era. Each weighed approximately 5.5 pounds, with a jaw spread of 14 inches when set, a spring tension requiring roughly 18 pounds of pressure to depress, and a 12-foot chain for staking into a stream bed. They were made by a blacksmith in St. Louis named Hector Bouchard, forged from recycled wagon iron, heavier and slightly less precise than the best British-made trap iron, but reliable in cold water. Bouchard's marks appear on the chain rings. They are still visible today. 6 months passed. Nothing. The frontier routinely swallowed men whole. A disappeared trapper might have died of any number of causes. exposure, accident, disease, violence, and the record would simply stop. Fort Raymond received no word from Crale. No message passed through any of the 17 trading posts between St. Louis and the Yellowstone that summer. He was not listed as missing because no one had contracted him. He was not searched for because no one owned him. He was simply not there. And then, on the morning of October 14th, he was. He had been gone 183 days. He had traveled far enough to bring back pelts that spoke of a beaver population untouched by human trapping. The fat reserves in the thickened skin, revealed by the scraping thickness Macaulay's experienced fingers measured, indicated animals that had not been pressured by human activity in their watershed for several decades, possibly longer. The pelts were, in the quiet technical language of the fur trade, virgin territory pelts. They were worth, by 1807 market rates, between $8 and $12 each on the St. Louis wholesale market. By European auction standards, they would fetch between $22 and $30 per pelt. Crale had brought 3. He had set 3 traps. He had, apparently by choice, taken only 3 pelts from a valley that Macaulay privately estimated, based on fur condition alone, could support a sustained annual harvest of between 500 and 800 prime beaver per season. For a man with no money, no contract, and no institutional backing, what Elias Crale had declined to take out of that valley was worth more than most American citizens would earn in 40 years of labor. Nobody recorded asking him why. The trouble began the following morning when a trapper named Josiah Farrell approached Donald Macaulay with a proposition. Farrell was not a solitary operator like Crale. He was an expedition-minded man, the kind the fur companies preferred. Someone who understood the logic of scale, who could organize a party, divide labor, and bring back volume. He had 5 partners, 2 French-Canadian voyageurs named Deschamps and Lebrun, a Kentucky-born hunter called Sutter, a young half-Osage tracker who went by the name of Beaumont, and a German immigrant provisioner named Kessler, who handled equipment logistics. Farrell proposed that Fort Raymond's factor advance him provisions for a 6-man winter expedition into the Upper Territory on the condition that he could persuade Crale to guide them back to the valley before the first deep snowfall locked the mountain passes. Macaulay considered the proposal for approximately 30 minutes before approving it. What happened next was not recorded by Macaulay. What survives is a 3-sentence entry in Farrell's own field notebook, written that evening. Spoke with Crale at the river bend. He agreed to guide us as far as the valley entrance for a 1/4 share of first season harvest. He says we should leave before the week is out. The party of 7, Crale, Farrell, Deschamps, Lebrun, Sutter, Beaumont, and Kessler, departed Fort Raymond on October 19th, 1807. They traveled northwest along the Yellowstone River for 5 days, then turned north into terrain that had no American name and no American map. Macaulay recorded their departure in his factor's log with a single notation: Farrell party, 7 men, destination, Crale's ground, return expected, spring 1808. Only 3 men returned. Farrell came back on March 2nd, 1808, with Deschamps and Kessler. Sutter, Lebrun, Beaumont, and Elias Crale did not return. They were not found. No remains were recovered. No message was received. Farrell gave his account to Macaulay on the morning of his return, and Macaulay recorded it in 4 lines. Farrell reports the valley was reached. party separated in early November during a snowstorm. Sutter, LeBron, Beaumont, and the guide Crale were lost in the separation. Farrell and the two survivors wintered south of the main watershed and returned as soon as the passes opened. 4 lines. That was the entire official account of why 4 men did not come home. Farrell's own field notebook contains no entry between October 31st, 1807 and February 18th, 1808. 14 weeks of silence in a document that had recorded daily observations for the 3 months prior. That gap, 98 days, is one of the most studied absences in early frontier archive literature. Several historians over the past century have noted it. None have fully explained it. More significant than what Farrell said was what he didn't bring back. The party had departed Fort Raymond with full trapping equipment. Farrell, Deschamps, and Kessler returned with no pelts, no beaver skins, not one. After a winter expedition to a valley that Crale's 3 pelts suggested was the richest untouched beaver ground in the entire upper Missouri watershed, 3 professional fur workers returned with nothing. Farrell filed no insurance claim for lost equipment. He requested no emergency resupply credit from the fort's factor account. He collected his personal wages for the expedition, packed his equipment, and left Fort Raymond within 48 hours. He was never recorded at any Missouri River trading post again. Crale's 3 iron traps remained at Fort Raymond. Nobody claimed them. The traps sat in a storage shed at Fort Raymond, and then at a succession of other locations as the frontier posts reorganized, consolidated, and eventually closed. For more than a century before anyone paid them serious attention, Fort Raymond itself ceased licensed operations in 1811, absorbed into the expanding infrastructure of Manuel Lisa's Missouri Fur Company. Its physical structure was dismantled for timber by 1813. Its ledgers, factors logs, and associated materials were boxed and shipped to St. Louis with varying degrees of care. A portion of that archive ended up in the possession of a St. Louis merchant family named Delacroix, who had been creditors of the original fort operation. The archive passed through 3 estate distributions and 2 storage facility transfers over the following decades. By 1891, most observers who knew of its existence assumed it had been destroyed in one of the 2 major St. Louis warehouse fires of the 1850s. It had not been destroyed. It had been packed into 7 wooden crates in a dry stone cellar in Jefferson City, Missouri, and forgotten. In March of 1947, a woman named Harriet Voss, employed as a processing archivist for the Missouri Historical Society, was working through a donated collection of materials from the estate of a deceased Jefferson City attorney whose family had roots in the old Delacroix merchant network. The collection had been donated with no formal catalog, no condition report, and no provenance documentation beyond a handwritten note that read, in its entirety, "Old fur trade papers, some equipment, before 1820. Voss spent 11 days processing the documentary materials before she reached the wooden crate at the back of the storage lot. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated burlap, she found 3 iron leg-hold traps. They were heavily corroded but structurally intact. The chain rings on 2 of them were fused by rust. On the 3rd trap, the jaw plates were still mobile, though stiff. Voss logged them. 3 times iron beaver traps, hand-forged, estimated 1800 to 1820. Condition, fair to poor. She did not notice the markings until 6 days later. when she was photographing the collection for the archive record. The markings were on the inside face of the lower jaw plate of the third trap, the one with the mobile jaw. They were shallow, scratched, rather than engraved, with what had probably been a knife point or nail into metal that was already showing surface oxidation when the marks were made. Time and rust had partially obscured them. But in the black and white photograph Voss took under a 40-watt bulb in the archive's documentation room, with shadows falling at precisely the right angle across the corroded surface, they were unmistakable. Lines, curves, one mark that was clearly a directional arrow, several marks that might have been elevation indicators, and in the lower right corner of the jaw face, scratched smaller and shallower than anything else, a sequence of 4 characters. Voss stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she walked across the hall and knocked on the door of the Society's chief curator, a historian named Gerald Pruitt, and placed the photograph on his desk without comment. Pruitt studied it for several minutes. "Is that a map?" he asked. "I think so," Voss said. "Where did it come from?" She told him about the collection, the crates, the burlap-wrapped traps, the Jefferson City attorney's estate. Pruitt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up the photograph again and held it under his desk lamp, tilting it to different angles. "The 4 characters in the corner," he said quietly. "Do you see them?" She saw them. She had been looking at them for 20 minutes before she came to his office. The 4 small marks bore the closest resemblance. When Voss compared them that afternoon against a reference volume on Assiniboine pictographic notation to a symbol that appeared in only one known context in the early 19th century documentary record of the Upper Missouri Territory, a symbol that Lewis and Clark's cartographers had specifically been instructed in a letter from the Secretary of War dated August 1806 not to include on any published map of the American interior. Nobody had ever explained why. It took Gerald Pruitt 4 months to locate the source document. The letter from the Secretary of War, Henry Dearborn serving under President Jefferson, was not in the published Lewis and Clark archive. It had never been in the published Lewis and Clark archive. It existed in a single handwritten copy, filed under the wrong date in a subsidiary box of Jefferson administration correspondence held at the Library of Congress, a box miscatalogued in 1879 and sitting under the incorrect reference number for 68 years. Pruitt found it on the 3rd day of a research visit to Washington in July of 1947. The letter was dated August the 22nd, 1806. It was addressed to General William Clark directly, and it contained 7 paragraphs of administrative language about the terms of the expedition's final report. The 6th paragraph read, in its relevant portion, "You are directed to omit from the published cartographic record any reference to the drainage valley located at the coordinates communicated to this office by your field notation of June 14th, 1806. The strategic importance of that location to the current negotiations will be better served by its absence from public knowledge. This instruction is to be understood as final." The coordinates referenced in that paragraph did not appear in the letter itself, but they appeared scratched into the lower jaw of a hand-forged iron beaver trap in a notation system that Elias Crale had apparently adapted from an Assiniboine pictographic convention on a piece of metal that had been sitting in a wooden crate in a Jefferson City cellar for 139 years. Pruitt could not make the coordinates resolve to a precise geographic location with the reference materials available to him in 1947. The Assiniboine pictographic system was not a longitude-latitude framework. It was a relative directional system anchored to physical landmarks, ridge lines, river forks, specific rock formations that existed in the territory but were named on no American map. To decode it fully, he needed either the field notation of June 14th, 1806, the one referenced by Dearborn's letter, or someone with direct knowledge of the terrain those marks described. The field notation did not appear in the published journals. Pruitt began looking for it. It would take him 3 more years and searches through 14 separate archives across 5 states before he found it. And what it described would change everything he thought he knew about the valley Crale had walked out of. He had one more piece of information that he told no one. When Harriet Voss re-examined the 3rd iron trap under magnification in the summer of 1950, after Pruitt had shared with her the contents of Clark's suppressed notation, she found something she had missed entirely in her original 1947 processing. On the exterior face of the upper jaw plate, the side facing away from the camera in her original photograph, the side she had logged as too corroded for imaging, there were additional marks, fainter, more damaged by rust. She could not photograph them successfully, but under a 6-power jeweler's loupe, held at a precise angle to a single incandescent bulb, she could see them clearly enough to trace them by hand onto a sheet of paper. They were not Crale's markings. The notation style was different, more regular, more practiced, formed with a tool finer than a knife point. And in the lower corner of those marks, where Crale had scratched his 4 Assiniboine-derived symbols, someone else had scratched their own identifier. 2 letters, small, certain, H.B. Hudson's Bay Company. The trap had been marked twice, once by Elias Crale going in, once by someone else coming out. The document Gerald Pruitt had been hunting for 3 years was stored inside a gray archival box that someone had labeled in faded brown ink, Miscellaneous Expedition Papers, Western Territories, circa 1800 to 1810. The box sat on a shelf in the private reading room of a Philadelphia estate attorney's office in a townhouse on Locust Street on the morning of September 4th, 1950. The estate in question belonged to the late widow of a man named Leonard Biddle, a distant relation of Nicholas Biddle, the Philadelphia lawyer who had edited the first published version of the Lewis and Clark journals in 1814, and who had, in the process of that editing, made certain decisions about which materials to include and which to quietly set aside. The box had not been opened in at least 30 years. The dust on its lid was uniform and undisturbed, the kind of layered gray film that accumulates at a predictable rate in still closed rooms and can be read almost like a calendar. Pruitt estimated 25 to 30 years. His hands were steady when he lifted the lid. His breath was not. The Clark Field notation was the 9th document in the stack. It had been folded 3 times horizontally until it was roughly the size of a pocket watch case. When Pruitt unfolded it under the reading room's single lamp, the paper cracked at the innermost crease, a crease that had been set so long ago the fibers had partially separated. He laid it flat with both palms and read it without moving for 11 minutes. Then he took out his notebook and began to write. William Clark had seen a great deal of the American West by the summer of 1806. He had navigated the Missouri River to its headwaters. He had crossed the Continental Divide in the dead of winter. He had descended the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean, spent a miserable rain-soaked season on the coast, and made the long traverse home across terrain that had no name on any map he had ever consulted. By any measure, he was the most experienced American wilderness traveler alive at the time he wrote the notation that Pruitt was now reading. A man of that experience did not use the word extraordinary carelessly. He used it twice on that single page. The notation described a valley observed from a high ridge on June 14th, 1806, during the eastward return leg of the expedition. Clark estimated the valley floor at approximately 5 square miles, a broad, sheltered basin fed by a river branch of significant volume, accessible from the south through a single narrow corridor between two ridge faces of perhaps 40 feet separation at their closest point. He noted dense willow and alder stands along the river margins. He noted standing water in the valley's northern quadrant, and what he characterized as an extraordinary density of beaver sign, dam construction, bank burrow networks, and felling activity exceeding any comparable waterway I've observed in 10 years of Western travel. He made a rough compass bearing from his ridge position, estimated his elevation at approximately 6,400 feet above sea level, and noted that the valley lay in a drainage basin that did not connect to any river system he had previously charted. It was, in the strictest geographic sense, a closed system, water in, no charted water out. A hydrological pocket, invisible from any navigable waterway, unreachable without specific knowledge of the ridge corridor approach. Clark described two other things that Pruitt underlined immediately. At the valley's northern end, he noted a rock formation approximately 40 feet in height, bearing what he described as a mineral exposure of unusual character, the color of old copper, the smell strongly of sulfur, and the surface presenting a crystalline structure I have not previously encountered in the Western Territories. He did not identify the mineral by name. He was not a geologist, but Pruitt was looking at that description in 1950, 12 years after geologists working for the federal government had produced the first comprehensive mineral survey of the Upper Missouri watershed region, a survey that had specifically identified one significant copper sulfide deposit in the entire region, a deposit in a closed drainage basin, a deposit whose surface exposure was estimated at 43 feet in height. A deposit that, by the survey's own internal valuation, contained extractable copper reserves estimated at between 800,000 and 1.2 million tons. The valley was not just a beaver ground. It was a mineral deposit of national consequence. The second thing Clark underlined was the cairn. At the valley's southern entrance, the narrow corridor between the ridge faces, Clark noted a constructed stone cairn of a type he associated specifically with Hudson's Bay Company trail marking practice. He had encountered similar structures in the Northern Territories during the 1804 push toward the Mandan villages, where HBC influence extended well south of any officially acknowledged boundary. This cairn bore a carved date on its facing stone. Clark read it as 1798, 8 years before he stood on that ridge. 9 years before Elias Crale walked into Fort Raymond carrying 3 traps and 3 pelts and said nothing about where he had been. Someone had found that valley in 1798 and marked it with a British company identifier. And then, in all the years that followed, no British map, no HBC trade record, and no published survey had ever acknowledged its existence. Pruitt sat in that Philadelphia reading room for 4 hours before he was asked to leave for the day. He made 12 pages of notes. On the train back to St. Louis, he wrote a single question at the top of a clean page and circled it twice. Who was operating in that valley for Britain in 1798? And where did they go? The answer required understanding what the Upper Missouri watershed meant to Britain in the decade bracketing 1800, and that required understanding a political situation that most American history textbooks had compressed into a single sentence. The boundary between the United States and British Canada west of the Great Lakes did not exist in any legally fixed form until the Convention of 1818, when American and British negotiators agreed to extend the 49th parallel as the dividing line from the Lake of the Woods to the Rocky Mountains. Before 1818, the territory was contested. Both nations claimed it. Both nations operated in it. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670 and operating as a practical government across enormous swaths of northern North America, had been running trade networks through the Upper Missouri region since at least the 1780s. Its agents mapped, marked, and worked territory that American law would not formally claim for decades. The beaver pelt was the currency that made this contest matter at the scale it did. By 1800, European demand for beaver felt, used in hat production across England, France, and the German states, had driven prices high enough that a single productive drainage basin could generate revenues equivalent to a small colonial tax district. The HBC's annual fur intake in peak years exceeded 150,000 pelts. The company's London board understood, with the precision of a banking institution, exactly what each unmapped valley in the interior of North America was worth in real currency. They did not leave productive valleys unmarked. They did not leave them undefended. And they did not, under any circumstances, allow their locations to appear on any map that could be accessed by American competitors. A valley with a closed drainage system, a prime beaver population untouched for decades, and a copper sulfide mineral exposure of the character Clark described in 1806 was not simply a fur trade asset. It was a negotiating chip. The Convention of 1818 was not just a line drawn on a map. It was a boundary established through years of back-channel diplomacy in which both governments traded concessions on specific territorial claims. If the British held documented proof of prior occupation, a cairn dated 1798, a survey record, a mapping notation of a valley containing those resources, that documentation was leverage, real, quantifiable, politically significant leverage. Jefferson's Secretary of War had ordered Clark to erase the valley from the published record in August of 1806. The Convention of 1818 would not be negotiated for another 12 years. Someone in the Jefferson administration had understood, a decade in advance, that the valley's existence needed to stay off the American public record until the boundary question was resolved, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that the British had been there first, and acknowledging that meant losing it. The 3 iron traps on the counter at Fort Raymond were not just a trapper's equipment. They were sitting at the edge of a territorial dispute worth more than any individual state in the young American Republic. Pruitt needed access to Hudson's Bay Company records. This was not a simple request for an American academic in 1950. The HBC maintained its primary historical archive in London, at the company's Beaver House headquarters, and access for outside researchers was tightly controlled and rarely granted. Pruitt wrote to the archive in November of 1950. He received no reply for 6 weeks. When the reply arrived, it informed him that his request had been received and would be reviewed. No timeline was given. He pursued a second avenue. The HBC maintained a secondary archive in Winnipeg, Manitoba, at the company's Canadian headquarters, established there in 1920, when the London headquarters had transferred a portion of its historical records for Canadian administrative purposes. Through a colleague at the University of Minnesota, a Canadian-born historian named Francis Delorme, who had conducted fur trade research in Winnipeg in the 1940s, Pruitt arranged an informal research visit for April of 1951. The Winnipeg Archive held HBC personnel records going back to 1790 for the company's North American field operations. It held expedition logs, trade post accounts, and what the archive cataloged as field agent assignment records, the internal documentation of who was sent where and when. Pruitt spent 4 days in Winnipeg. He was looking for any HBC agent assigned to the Upper Missouri watershed region between 1795 and 1810. He found 31 names. Most of them were voyageurs, coureurs de bois, and seasonal trade post workers, men assigned to established HBC posts along the Red River, the Assiniboine, and the lower reaches of the Missouri. They were not surveyors. They were not the kind of agents who built cairns and scratched dates into facing stones. Pruitt worked methodically through the 31 names, cross-referencing assignment dates against geographic territories, until he had eliminated 28 of them on the basis of confirmed locations far from the Upper Missouri watershed in the years that mattered. 3 names remained. 2 of them were listed as deceased in the HBC personnel records by 1810, with deaths attributed to causes the records described as accident in field. The 3rd was a man named Thomas Galt. Pruitt read Galt's assignment record 3 times without stopping. Thomas Galt was listed in the HBC personnel file as a surveyor and field agent, born in Edinburgh in 1771, recruited into company service in 1793. His assignment history ran to 7 pages of close-written notation. He had worked the northern Red River posts, the Athabasca Trade Network, and the Lake Superior boundary region through the late 1790s. In 1798, the same year Clark had read from the Cairnstone, Galt had been officially assigned to what the HBC file designated as the Southwest Survey Initiative, a category Pruitt recognized immediately as a deliberate bureaucratic vagueness. Companies didn't name sensitive geographical programs explicitly in personnel files. They categorized them generically, the way a military operation gets a code name that tells you nothing. Galt's activity under the Southwest Survey Initiative was logged in broad strokes. He had been in the Upper Missouri region from 1798 to 1808, 10 years. He had made at least 6 documented return trips to Montreal and back. He had filed reports that the archive listed by date, but whose contents were described only as survey materials restricted. He had returned to Montreal for the final time in December of 1808. His return expedition log for that final journey was not restricted. It was a routine travel document. Dates, provisions consumed, route taken. The kind of administrative record that got filed without anyone thinking it mattered. Pruitt read through it, looking for anything unusual. He found it in the third paragraph of Galt's entry dated October 28, 1808. The entry described a return journey that had taken Galt south of his usual route to, as he recorded it, recover survey equipment and documentation stored at the Southern Valley Station, neglected during the disruption of the previous autumn. The previous autumn was 1807. The disruption of the previous autumn was what Josiah Farrell had described in 4 lines to Donald Macaulay. A snowstorm, a separation, 4 men lost. Pruitt set down his pencil and looked at the wall of the Winnipeg Archive reading room for a long time. Then he picked the pencil up again and began cross-referencing dates. Galt's 1808 return trip had taken him through the upper Missouri region in late October and early November of 1808. But his previous documented presence in the region, the period before the disruption of the previous autumn, placed him in the upper Missouri watershed in the autumn of 1807. The same autumn that Farrell's party of 7 had followed Elias Crale northwest along the Yellowstone and turned north into terrain with no American name. Thomas Galt had been in that valley when they arrived. Pruitt found Galt's 1807 field notes on the morning of the 4th day in a box that had been filed under the wrong agent number, a cataloging error that had placed Galt's materials under a deceased agent's designation. The error had never been corrected. The notes had not been accessed since their original filing, based on the condition of the folder's ties. They were not comprehensive. They were the working notes of a field surveyor, compass bearings, elevation estimates, water depth readings, mineral sample locations. But Galt kept a brief daily journal alongside his technical notation in a small separate book, and that journal covered the autumn of 1807. Pruitt read it with the Arkansas of a man who had spent 4 years working toward this moment. Galt recorded the arrival of the American party on November 3rd, 1807. He noted their number to 7 men, including one who appears to be the valley's original discoverer, carrying distinctively marked iron traps. He noted that the party established camp at the valley's southern end, near the river bend he had been using as his own base for the preceding 3 weeks. He recorded an initial exchange the following day that he characterized as restrained but firm on both sides. The Americans claim prior discovery rights, which I have contested on the basis of our 1798 survey record and the cairn marker. November 5th. Dispute formally articulated. The lead trapper, a man called Farrell, not the original discoverer, presented a verbal claim to exclusive American territorial rights on the basis of the Louisiana Purchase. I presented our documentation. No agreement reached. The original discoverer has said nothing throughout. November 6th. A difficulty has arisen that I will not elaborate here. The situation as of this evening is materially changed from what it was this morning. I have secured all survey documentation and primary instrument cases. My 2 men are prepared to travel at first light. November 7th. Departed the valley. Survey complete. All instruments and documentation secured. The Valley Station is closed. The entry for November 7th was the last in the 1807 section. Between November 6th and November 7th, 4 American men had ceased to exist in the documentary record. Josiah Farrell, who had survived, described their disappearance as a storm separation. Thomas Galt, who had also survived, described the preceding day only as a difficulty. He did not name the difficulty, he did not describe its nature, he elaborated nothing. He noted only that the situation had changed materially and that his documentation was secure. 4 men went into that valley and did not come out. Thomas Galt came out with every survey note, every instrument, and every piece of paper that confirmed the British had been there first. Josiah Farrell came out with nothing. No pelts, no equipment record, no explanation that lasted longer than 4 lines. Elias Crale, who had guided them all in, was among the 4 who did not return. And on the jaw of one of Crale's iron traps, someone had scratched the initials HB and a date after Galt had recorded his departure. After, not before. The initials had been scratched on November 6th, 1807. Galt's own journal confirmed he was still in the valley on November 6th. His departure entry was November 7th. Thomas Galt, or someone with him, had marked Crale's trap, while Crale was still alive to watch it happen, or immediately afterward. Pruitt wrote to the HBC London Archive again in the summer of 1951, this time with specific requests. He asked for Galt's complete survey notes from the Southwest Survey Initiative. He asked for the restricted field reports filed between 1798 and 1808. He asked for any documentation relating to the valley that the Clark notation described. The reply came 5 weeks later. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged his requests. The second stated that the materials he had described fell under the provisions of a bilateral confidentiality agreement concluded between representatives of the Crown and the United States government in 1822, the terms of which restrict access to the relevant documentation for a period of 150 years from the date of agreement. 150 years from 1822 was 1972, 21 years away. The materials were sealed by an agreement that neither government had ever publicly acknowledged. Pruitt could not access them. No American researcher could access them. The archive had not even confirmed that the materials existed, only that if they did, they could not be discussed. Someone on the American side had signed that agreement in 1822. 4 years after the Convention of 1818 fixed the 49th parallel as the boundary. Someone had negotiated not just a border, but a silence. A sealed record ensuring that whatever happened in that valley in November of 1807 could not be examined by any researcher in either country for a century and a half. Pruitt filed the reply letter in his research folder. He made a note in his journal that he did not underline. He had learned by that point that underlining drew attention he could not afford. Harriet Voss had kept the original documentation photographs and the hand-traced rubbing of the trap's upper jaw markings in her own files since 1950. She was methodical by professional habit. When Pruitt shared Galt's journal entries with her in September of 1951, she went back to her rubbing of the upper jaw marks and studied them for 2 hours under a desk lamp. She called Pruitt the following morning. She had been reading the HB initials as she had always read them, as a company identifier, 2 letters, nothing more. but the rubbing showed something beneath the initials that she had been mentally discarding as rust damage. She had assumed the striations were corrosion artifacts. Under the context of what Pruitt had just told her, that Thomas Galt had been in that valley, that he had been a surveyor, that he had specifically noted the iron traps belonging to a man he described as their original discoverer. She looked at those striations again. They were not corrosion. They were numbers. Small, scratched with the same fine tool as the initials, in a notation style consistent with a surveyor's field shorthand. Most of them were too damaged to read with certainty, but 2 of them were clear enough that Voss was willing to stake her professional judgment on them. The first was a bearing, a compass bearing, in the notation format a trained HBC surveyor would use. The second was a date. Not November 6th, 1807. Not any date Pruitt had been working with. The date scratched beneath Thomas Galt's initials on the jaw of a trap that had belonged to Elias Crale was October 19th, 1807. Farrell's party had departed Fort Raymond on October 19th, 1807. They had not reached the valley until, by Galt's own account, November 3rd. 15 days of travel separated the departure date from the arrival date. Thomas Galt had scratched his initials onto Crale's trap on the day the party left Fort Raymond. He had been at Fort Raymond on October 19th, 1807. He had been there when the 7 men departed. He had seen them go. He had followed them in, or he had been there already waiting, knowing the route, because he had known Crale before either of them ever reached that valley. He had marked the trap before any dispute, before any difficulty, before any of the 4 men who did not come home had had any reason to be afraid. He had marked it on the first day, as if he already knew how it was going to end. Gerald Pruitt died in March of 1969. He was 71 years old, and he died knowing he had been correct about almost everything and unable to prove any of it. His research files, 64 folders covering 19 years of investigation, were donated to the Missouri Historical Society by his widow in the autumn of that same year. They arrived in 11 cardboard boxes. They were cataloged, shelved in the Society's archival storage, and not examined by another researcher for 5 years. Harriet Voss died in February of 1974. She was 68 years old. She had continued her own parallel line of research for 23 years after her initial discovery, quietly and without institutional support. In the hours before her regular working day began, she had never published. She had never presented at a conference. She had spent the last 8 years of her life waiting for a date, 1972. The year the bilateral confidentiality agreement concluded in 1822 was supposed to expire. 150 years. It expired on schedule. Neither Pruitt nor Voss lived to see what came out of the London archive when the seal lifted. What came out changed the entire shape of the story. The materials released by the Hudson's Bay Company Archive in London in January of 1972 included, among other documents, the complete Southwest Survey Initiative files for the Upper Missouri watershed region covering the years 1796 through 1810. The files ran to more than 400 pages of survey notation, expedition correspondence, administrative ledgers, and field agent communication. They had been sealed, formally by bilateral agreement, for 150 years. Their release was not announced publicly, No press release accompanied them. A notation was added to the HBC Archive's internal catalog. A small number of British historians with active access to the archive began working through them over the following 18 months. It was a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh named Margaret Haworth who first understood what she was looking at. She was 26 years old, writing a doctoral thesis on HBC territorial expansion in the pre-1818 boundary period, and she had requested the Southwest Survey files as a routine part of her research. She expected administrative detail and surveying records. She found in a locked subsidiary folder within the main file, a folder whose existence was not listed in the archive's catalog, the complete field agent correspondence of Thomas Galt from 1803 to 1808. All of it, including the letters he had written to his Montreal supervisor, a company director named Andrew Warwick, in the 2 months before Farrell's party walked into the valley. Haworth read those letters over a period of 3 days. On the third day, she stopped her research, went back to her office, and wrote a letter of her own to the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, asking whether a historian named Gerald Pruitt was still reachable. She had found his name in a footnote in a 1953 fur trade research journal, a small paper, practically unread. The Society's reply informed her that Pruitt had died in 1969, but that his research files were held in their collection. Was she interested in access? She was on a plane to St. Louis within 4 weeks. The Galt correspondence told a story that Pruitt had come close to reconstructing from the outside and missed in one fundamental way. In a letter dated August 29, 1803, Galt wrote to Andrew Warwick from a post on the Upper Red River with a recommendation regarding an American frontier trapper he had encountered at a seasonal trade gathering near the confluence of the Knife River. The trapper was, Galt wrote, a solitary operator of considerable wilderness skill, known among the American trading networks as Crale, with no fixed contractual allegiance and a demonstrated facility for moving through American military and expedition circles without attracting formal attention. Galt recommended that Warwick consider engaging Crale as what the letter delicately termed a listener for our interests in the American interior. Warwick's reply, dated October 14, 1803, authorized the engagement. Elias Crale had been on the Hudson's Bay Company payroll since the autumn of 1803. His 4 appearances in American documentary records, the Kaskaskia Provisioners Journal, the St. Louis Shipping Ledger, the Fort Bellefontaine Overnight Roster, and William Clark's personal diary, were not the scattered footprints of a solitary trapper drifting through the frontier. They were the operational pattern of an intelligence asset moving deliberately through American networks, positioned to observe and report. Clark had found him heading north in July of 1806. Crale had spent that summer in the Upper Missouri watershed with Galt's survey team, helping to map the valley that Clark had spotted from a ridge and been officially ordered to forget. He was not a trapper who happened to find a valuable valley. He was a company scout who had known about that valley for at least 3 years before he walked into Fort Raymond with 3 pelts and 3 iron traps and performed an act of carefully calibrated silence. The 3 iron traps themselves were proof of this. When Haworth opened Pruitt's research files in St. Louis and cross-referenced them against the Galt correspondence, she found in a 1950 HBC Montreal supply ledger unearthed by Pruitt during his Winnipeg research trip and left in his files without full annotation, a procurement entry dated March of 1806. A street. Louis blacksmith named Hector Bouchard, the same Bouchard whose marks appeared on the chain rings of Crale's traps, held a standing supply contract with an HBC Montreal procurement agent for the period 1800 to 1809. The contract covered iron goods. 3 hand-forged leg-hold traps, matching the weight and specification of the traps in the Missouri Historical Society collection, appeared in the March 1806 procurement entry under the designation Field Equipment, Southwest Survey Initiative. The traps had been made for the HBC. They had been issued to Crale as company equipment. When he set them on the counter at Fort Raymond on October 14, 1807, he was carrying British tools on an American frontier. And every man in that trading post had looked at those pelts and seen only extraordinary wealth, because that was exactly what Crale had needed them to see. The October 19th date scratched beneath Galt's initials, the date Voss had identified as the day Farrell's party departed Fort Raymond, became the central question once Howarth understood Crale's operational role. Galt had been at Fort Raymond on October 19, 1807. This was not, in light of the correspondence, a coincidence. A letter from Galt to Warwick, dated September 12, 1807, written from a post on the Upper Yellowstone, described his awareness that Crale had returned to Fort Raymond and that an American party was forming to follow him back to the valley. Galt wrote that he planned to position myself at the fort to assess the American party's composition and capabilities before the departure, and to relay final instructions to our man before his final service. Final service. Hayworth underlined those 2 words in her reading notes. She wrote beside them, Crale knew what was planned. He agreed to it, or he had no choice. The plan, reconstructed from the Galt correspondence and cross-referenced against the Warwick administrative responses, was not a plan to kill 4 Americans. That was not what the HBC had sanctioned or intended. The plan was more precise and more devastating than simple violence. Crale was to guide Farrell's party deep into the valley and allow them to remain there long enough to be formally documented by Galt as a British surveyor with legal standing, as American trespassers on territory under active HBC survey. Documented trespass created a legal record. A legal record created a negotiating instrument. When the boundary talks began in earnest, British diplomats would be able to produce sworn documentation that American trappers had entered and occupied HBC mapped territory, territory that Britain had been actively surveying since 1798, and demand territorial concessions in exchange for not pressing the matter formally. The beaver pelts were a lure, the valley was a trap, and Elias Crale, who had spent 4 years feeding information from the American frontier to a company operating out of Montreal, had walked 6 men into it. The plan failed on November 6, 1807. Galt's journal described it as a difficulty that changed the situation materially. The Galt correspondence to Warwick, dated December of 1807 after his return to civilization, described it in 12 sentences that Haworth read 4 times before she trusted her interpretation. Farrell had found out. Exactly how was not specified. Galt wrote only that the American leader became aware, through means I have not fully ascertained, of our man's prior connection to this office. Farrell had confronted Crale in the camp on the evening of November 6th. Crale had not denied it. The confrontation had escalated. 3 of Farrell's 5 partners, Sutter, LeBron, and Beaumont, had been present and had attempted to physically restrain Crale when he moved toward Galt's camp on the valley's far side. What happened in the next several hours, Galt wrote, was beyond the scope of my ability to prevent or to fully witness, as I was at distance and visibility was poor. When it was over, 3 men were dead, and Elias Crale, and the man who had guided them all in, was also dead. Farrell had killed his own guide. Not in a snowstorm, not in any separation. Josiah Farrell, on the night of November 6th, 1807, had killed Elias Crale somewhere in the darkness of that valley, and then had removed every piece of evidence that Crale had ever been connected to the Hudson's Bay Company, carried the 3 iron traps out of the valley personally, deposited them at Fort Raymond without filing a claim, and told 4 lines of story to Donald Macaulay that would remain the official account for the next 143 years. Galt had watched it happen from across the valley. He had let it happen. Crale dead was better than Crale alive, and capable of being taken to an American court and compelled to testify about his company relationships. He had departed the following morning, November 7th, with every survey note secured and the documentation of American trespass intact. He had the legal record he needed. He just could not use a dead informant as a witness. Without Crale's testimony, the documented trespass was incomplete. The HBC's legal position in the 1818 negotiations was weaker than it would have been. The convention fixed the 49th parallel, with the valley sitting by 11 miles on the American side of the line. Britain conceded the mineral deposit in exchange for concessions elsewhere that neither government ever formally itemized. The 1822 bilateral confidentiality agreement sealed everything, including the American government's knowledge that one of their own frontier operators had spent years feeding intelligence to a foreign company, and that 4 Americans had died in a foreign territorial operation that no American official had authorized and no American court had ever examined. The valley was, in the end, buried twice, once by Dearborn's letter in 1806, and once by the agreement of 1822. The British sealed it to protect a company's strategic interests. The Americans sealed it to protect the integrity of a border treaty that the public believed had been negotiated cleanly. Both governments agreed in writing to say nothing. For 150 years, the agreement held. Margaret Howarth published her findings in a 1975 paper in the Canadian Historical Review. It was 63 pages long, heavily footnoted and written in the careful, qualified language of academic history. It was read by approximately 800 scholars over the following decade. It generated 3 responses in the subsequent issue and a brief mention in a 1979 fur trade history anthology. It did not make the newspapers. It did not reach the popular press. The Missouri Historical Society issued a statement acknowledging the Pruitt and Voss research files as foundational to Hayworth's work. Gerald Pruitt received a posthumous acknowledgement in a footnote on page 4. Harriet Voss received her name in the bibliography. Elias Crale received 2 sentences in the paper's conclusion. The agent identified in HBC correspondence only as Crale appears to have died in the valley on or about November 6, 1807, under circumstances that remain legally unresolved. His birth name, place of origin, and prior history before 1803 are entirely unknown. The valley itself, formally identified and mapped by an American Geological Survey team in 1938, assigned a federal survey designation in 1943, and quietly protected under a land management order in 1961, was listed in the 1975 National Register of Historic Property Surveys as a site of geographic significance with no associated historical narrative. Its copper deposit, assessed at 900,000 tons of extractable ore by a 1959 declassified survey, was never mined. The cost of access to a closed drainage basin 11 miles north of any road made the economics impractical. The valley sat as it had always sat, sheltered, cold, beyond any navigable waterway, while the world catalogued it and left it alone. A team of historians from Washington University conducted the first formal archaeological survey of the valley in 1991, 84 years after Farrell walked out of it. They found the HBC cairn at the southern entrance, or what remained of it, 31 stones in a scatter pattern, consistent with a structure that had collapsed inward over many decades. The facing stone with the carved date was among them. It read 1798, exactly as Clark had recorded it in his June 14th field notation. They found the fire scars and cache pit remnants of the Indian wintering camp Clark had described. They found the mineral exposure at the valley's northern end, 41 feet in height, its copper-tinted surface unchanged by 185 years of weather. They found one more thing. At the edge of the tree line, 43 feet from the river bend that Galt's journals described as his base camp, they found the remains of a fire pit surrounded by 8 flat stones arranged as seat positions. Mixed into the fire pit ash, preserved by the valley's unusual aridity, protected from annual flooding by a slight elevation in the surrounding ground, were fragments of a cast iron chain link, corroded almost entirely through, and 3 anchor stakes of the kind used to secure a beaver trap's chain to a stream bed. Elias Crale had set his traps at that river bend. He had camped beside them. He had built a fire and sat with the men he had guided in and known, on some level, what was coming. He had scratched a map into the jaw of one of his traps before any of it happened. Not as evidence for an American court, not as a claim for any company, but as the solitary act of a man who understood that the valley needed to exist somewhere outside the control of the people fighting over it. He had encoded it in a language that split the difference between his two worlds. A Assiniboine pictographic notation, a system no fur company ledger would ever think to consult. He had trusted the metal to outlast the men. The third iron trap sits in the Missouri Historical Society collection today, in a climate-controlled archival drawer in St. Louis. Its accession number is 1947.031.3. It is logged in the collection database as Iron Beaver Trap, hand-forged, American Frontier, circa 1800 to 1815. Origin, Fort Raymond Estate Collection. The markings on the jaw plates are described in the internal condition report as surface engravings of uncertain character, partially obscured by corrosion, possible maker's marks. No one has updated the description. The jaw plate inscription was photographed for the last time in 1991 by a Washington University archivist supporting the Valley Survey. Those photographs exist in a university archive file that has been accessed 11 times since 1991. The map Crale scratched into the metal, the map that identifies the valley's location by bearing, elevation, and physical landmark reference, has never been formally decoded to modern geographic coordinates. The research required to do so has not been funded. It has been proposed twice. Once in a 1983 grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was declined, and once in a 1997 proposal to the Smithsonian, which was returned without review. Harriet Voss's hand-traced rubbing of the jaw plate markings, made in the summer of 1950 under a 6-power jeweler's loop, sits in Pruitt's research file, Box 7 of 11, Folder 39. It is the most accurate reproduction of the trap's markings that exists. Nobody has touched it in 9 years. Thomas Galt returned to Edinburgh in 1812, 4 years after his last Missouri watershed expedition. He retired from HBC service in 1819. 1 year after the convention fixed the border, he had spent a decade helping to make inevitable. He received a company pension of £60 annually and a formal letter of commendation signed by the HBC's London governor. He died in 1831 and is buried in a churchyard in the Edinburgh suburb of Morningside. His headstone reads, "In faithful service." His grave is well maintained. His name appears in 3 footnotes in the published academic literature on the 1818 convention. Josiah Farrell's trail ends at Fort Raymond on March 4th, 1808, 2 days after his return. He withdrew his full wage balance from the fort's account, settled one outstanding debt of $3.20 with a provisioner's ledger, and walked out of the gate. No subsequent record of him has ever been found in any American archive, court record, land deed, census roll, or military registration from any state or territory in the United States. A man who had organized and led a 7-person frontier expedition, who had survived a winter in the northern mountain wilderness, and who had walked back into American civilization, simply ceased to exist in the documentary record 48 hours after arriving back. He understood what he had done. He understood that the fewer places his name appeared going forward, the better. He was not wrong. Donald Macaulay, Fort Raymond's factor, transferred to a Hudson's Bay Company post in the Red River settlement in 1812. His employment with an American trading operation had ended, and he had taken a position with the company he had been quietly corresponding with since at least 1805. His factor's logbooks, including the entry dated October 14th, 1807 with the word unknown written in the home district column, are the most referenced documents in the entire story. Macaulay knew more than he wrote down. The question of how much more died with him in 1828 at a post on the Assiniboine River with no personal papers recovered. What Elias Crale knew on the morning of October 19th, 1807, when Thomas Galt scratched the initials HB into the jaw of his trap at Fort Raymond's gate. What he knew, and still walked out of that gate and guided 6 men toward a valley he understood was bait, is the question that the documentary record cannot answer fully, and the historians who have worked the case have never stopped turning over. He might have believed the plan would not require violence. He might have believed Galt's assurances, if there were any. He might have had no choice. A man on a company payroll, deep in a foreign territory with no legal standing and no protection from either side, does not always have the luxury of refusal. He might have scratched that map into the trap before the departure precisely because he did not believe those assurances, because he understood that he was walking towards something that required the valley to be remembered regardless of what happened to the men who knew about it. He set 3 traps in a valley that disappeared from every American map for 40 years. He was gone before any of them were collected. He left no will, no letter, no testimony, no grave marker. He left a piece of iron. He scratched a map into it with a knife point or a nail in a hybrid notation system that no single tradition would have fully recognized, trusting that the combination of a Assiniboine symbol and surveyor's bearing would outlast the bureaucratic machinery of 2 governments committed to forgetting. He was right. It took 140 years. A Scottish graduate student, 64 folders in 11 cardboard boxes, a rubbing on a sheet of paper made at 6 in the morning under a jeweler's loupe, and the expired seal of a secret agreement. But the valley survived in the record. Elias Crale's name did not. It exists in 4 documents before October 1807 and in 0 documents after. The published history of the Convention of 1818 does not mention him. The published history of the early Missouri fur trade does not mention him. He does not appear in any monument, any memorial, any institutional acknowledgement of the boundary that his death helped make possible. A boundary that has stood for more than 200 years, separating 2 countries whose governments agreed in 1822 that it was better if nobody remembered how the line got drawn. The 3 iron traps remain in a drawer in St. Louis. The valley, 11 miles north of any road, is still there.